For any evidence question, you really need to understand what the question wants from you and really focus on it because they're not lying to you in the question. If they want something, they want it. So you've got to give them the best evidence of that, right? So not some vague sense that something is related. You want to, as best you can, prove it. And so in this case, I think we're going to need to go through a bunch of different choices and try to really evaluate which one gets there the most. So the question, the two words that I would focus on, right, is tedious and repetitive. Now, there's other things in the question, right? The narrator, his occupation. Well, we would probably know just from reading the passage that, like, the narrator is always the person we're talking about. So any line is going to involve the narrator most likely in some way. And the occupation, we can kind of scan these choices here and see he's talking about the job all the time. So a lot of people tend to focus on those things. Do they talk about the job, right? Well, even when they don't say job, they're probably saying the job, right? So it's always part of the context. It's the setting of the story. So it's these other words, these strong words that we're going to need to focus on, tedious and repetitive. Now, I see some shades of this in choice A, right? Another day, another dollar. Another is a word that kind of suggests repetition, okay? So that's pretty cool. While the days roll on at their same steady pace, repetition, the accompanying dollars seem to lose their value. If not according to some spreadsheet in some vault at some deposit corporation, then at least in my own calculations of the price of my labor, the cost of my sanity. Now, cost of my sanity might mean I'm so bored out of my mind that my job is so tedious that I'm losing my mind. That's like a reasonable thing. Now, he's not exactly saying that, but it's close enough that I would certainly think that A could be the answer. It feels like a good match, but we need to keep reading. We have to read everything, and we need to be unbiased. Even if A turns out to be the right answer, we can't kind of like pick it in our mind until we've evaluated all the choices. It's just like a judge in a courtroom. You're not allowed to decide the case before you've heard both sides of the argument, the defense and the prosecution. So here's the same thing. You've got four lawyers. We got to listen to all of their cases. What is choice B telling us? What's their argument for why we should pick it? There would be times throughout the day when my mind seemed to simply leave my body. It's not like my body needed my mind. I had clicked and clacked those same keys thousands of times before. That's repetition, right? So my body knew the motions well. That's the benefit of monotony, I suppose. Well, monotony is boredom, tedium, right? So tedious fits there. So here's the thing, between A and B much more clearly comes out and says the things I needed to say, okay? Let's look at C and D, but already I've kind of switched my allegiance here. B feels a little bit safer. C says, I had begun working at Corporation X at some point in my late youth. At some other point, perhaps a Tuesday, my late youth turned into my early middle age. There's a vague negative kind of vibe about this line. The person seems unhappy about the job. It's reasonable to conclude that he's unhappy because it is tedious and repetitive. But notice none of those things are actually said here. This is a good example where the evidence is maybe in some sort of like subtext. It is implied, but we want it to be as explicit as possible. We want it to just be in the lines. So let's look at D. At various times I had sought to escape Corporation X by applying to jobs with corporations A through W, but I became so bored of the application process that alas I quit the idea of quitting. Well, notice here bored is, a good synonym for tedious. And it sounds like he's doing it a bunch of times because there's lots of corporations between A and W. It's all like jokes that he's telling, but whatever. The point is, he's not talking about his occupation. So if that was your focus, maybe here is a case where you at least could eliminate a choice, is that this is the one choice that does not talk about his occupation being boring. It talks about his application for other jobs being boring. So it's kind of moving off topic. But even still, it's not quite as on the nose as A or B are. And B does end up being the answer. And I can see why if you picked A, that might be frustrating to you. It seems like there's a lot going for choice A. But the main advice for anything with evidence, anything where we have a line that we're trying to match with a choice, like anything at all on the reading section really, you want to pick the choice that requires you to do the least work and the lines to do the most work, right? So if we think about it here, another day, another dollar, yeah, that makes sense that implies repetition, right? Another day, another dollar, or same steady pace, that hits repetition very nicely. But then that other piece about it being tedious, being boring, it doesn't actually say it. It's reasonable to conclude that it's boring because it's repetitive, or that it's boring because he's losing his mind over it. But it doesn't say that. That's you saying that. And we don't really want that. We want the lines to do the work. And choice B, I don't have to imagine what's happening. It just says it. It says he's striking the keys 1,000 times. That's repetition. He says there's monotony. That's tedium. That's tediousness. That's boring. So it just says it. I don't have to do the work, and that is why B is a better choice. So if you ever find yourself in situations like this where two choices seem very similar and both seem to check all the boxes, think about your own mind. How much work is your brain doing to justify it versus how much is the work kind of just done by the lines? The more that some of the lines, the more likely the choice is to be correct.